Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Ah, here I am in my office. Um, Anyhow, I thought it'd be good for a change. Maybe you can see me because there's no big window behind me. But we're going to look at mitochondrial DNA and the inheritance that goes with that. Remember, there are a few things that are interesting. I did a short video from Khan Academy on what mitochondrial DNA is and how it works and everything else. But it doesn't really talk about the idea of what is it when it comes to forensics. So when we look about this, when it comes to forensics, mitochondrial DNA, remember, is only inherited. It's extracellular, which means it doesn't come from the nucleus of the cell. It only comes from your mother. So there are only two really interesting things about mitochondria that people really kind of think about. Well, at the very beginning of the year, I said that the definition of death from a fully scientific point of view is the sensation of making ATP. Well, your mitochondria DNA are the things, or your mitochondria are the ones that make ATP, which provides all the energy for your cells, okay? Plants have something called a chloroplast, and we have mitochondria. Both of those things do the same thing. They take glucose and make it into ATP, and that's what you live off of, depending on what you eat, okay? So when you stop making ATP, which usually happens within the first 10 minutes of your death, that's when the mitochondria actually start shutting down and stop making ATP. Not all of them do that. When you're going through the stages of decomposition, remember we got all the way to the point of purge. Usually purge is, within the first 36 hours of your death or after the first 36 hours of death. That is actually when your mitochondria really start to shut down. Before then, depending on the situation, they actually may be able to take parts of your body, even though you've been dead for 3 days, and get it to the point where it might actually start working again, but not your entire body. Your brain will never be able to come back up again because it's the mitochondrial cells in your brains that are one of the first ones that die out. So what could they use? Who knows? But I know that there have been experiments that deal with that, but we won't get into that right now. Instead, you have your mitochondrial DNA. It has a circular type of DNA. There are only 2 regions on those pieces of DNA that we're really interested in. It does not eliminate individuals from a family. So if you have several siblings and a murder is committed and all they can find is DNA, all they can do is basically narrow it down to your family. They can't narrow it down to an individual. They can only do that with nuclear DNA. With mitochondrial DNA, like I said, they can only narrow it down to family. One of the most interesting things that I find about mitochondrial DNA is that there are only 7 different types, major types in the world, in all humans on the entire planet, which means if you've only inherited from your mother, at some time in our past, way back when, there were only 7 living females on the planet that had a child. There could have been more that didn't have child, but there was 7 at least that had child, and only 7. And if those 7 individuals had been wiped out, the human race would not be here anymore, which is kind of interesting. I think it's very interesting, at least. From there, mitochondrial DNA processes is very expensive. It's very time consuming. It takes several weeks. But however, it can be done on certain things that you cannot find nuclear DNA in. So you have some old bones, you can usually find mitochondrial DNA in it. If you have old skin and old hair, you can usually find mitochondrial DNA in it. It, again, will narrow down the process, but only to the family. And then it's, like I said, on the other thing is that it's extremely cost effective. It is very, very costly to do it. It takes a lot of expertise, a lot of special equipment, and a lot of time. So most places will not do mitochondrial DNA unless they absolutely 100% have to narrow something they'll just try and get nuclear DNA whenever they possibly can. From there, probably the most interesting thing to come out of that is the idea of CODIS, the combined DNA index system, which developed in the early 80s and really got going in the 90s. And from the early 80s, it was more of a, let's see if we have anything that we can match, because they weren't really using DNA very much at that point, but they were just looking at it to see if there was a process. By the late 80s, we started using DNA as part of our forensics, and it actually became to the point where court cases were allowed to use it in prosecution, which was in 1987. And then from there, it went to, okay, now that we have all this information, how do we collect it? Well, in the early 80s, early 90s, late 80s, they started collecting that information and putting it in certain databases. It wasn't until they started taking all those databases and combining them and then expanding who you could collect the DNA from. So who can you collect DNA from? Anyone who's ever been convicted of a felony crime. Anyone who's currently in the jail system or prison system, justice system, as whatever it may be, okay? Anyone who has ever served in any type of military capacity for the U.S. Army or the U.S. Navy or whatever it may be, they can collect it. They don't necessarily have to, but they can. Anyone who works for the government in a sensitive job. So, and what I mean by a sensitive job, that's anything from the post office to, tax collection. Anything they want to put in there is what they can put in there. They can collect all that stuff. Now, most of the time they don't, okay? It wasn't until I think I was in the military and I applied or needed to apply for a top secret security clearance that they finally come in and said, we're going to take your blood, and with that, we're going to take DNA and put you in a sample. That was part of the process of going and getting that certification. So you have CODIS. CODIS is a big, big, big thing now. Huge. Goes all the way. And we also share that with Interpol, which is the International Police Association, which most countries in the world are part of. There are only really 3 countries that are not: Russia, China, and North Korea. All other countries are pretty much part of Interpol, and they will cooperate with each other and share information. So if you commit a crime in any of those 3 places, you might not get caught by Interpol, but the punishments that you get in those places are probably a lot worse than you get anyhow. So anyhow, you then have DNA evidence. So how do you collect DNA evidence, and what do you do with it? I think we'll save that for our next time, and that will be the end of chapter 9. And at that time, we'll look at the questions at the end of the chapter. So at this point, what I want you to do is take a look at the Khan Academy video and answer the questions that will be attached to this date's request for class. Okay?